my real experience with addiction and mental health, probably like many of us, we've had our own life experience, right? Of um, various situations and means to cope with those situations that have led us to, growth, right? And understanding or coming closer to being who we are authentically, and what we need in order to be more authentic, right?
Mhm.
So I started out in the world of engineering. I was in the Air Force, and I still do very much enjoy and love science. And in fact, I think that it is not separate from spirituality. I think that there is very much the ability for science to um, be a language of the spiritual and vice versa.
Mhm.
But through my own experiences of trauma, I went through my own therapy and have experienced chemical addiction as well as chemical dependency. So we're going to talk about the difference. And then um, addiction, the early signs of addiction, I would say, and I was fortunate enough to have, support that it did not become for me something that I wasn't able to recover from.
Mm.
Um, but all of my therapy on my work on myself, led to me discovering that authentically, even in the work I did before I became a therapist, I was sort of performing a lot of the um, functions, if you will, or aspects of being a therapist or a counselor within my various roles with other people. It was something that was authentic to me, that was
Mhm.
natural, and so I went back to school to become a counselor and worked in trauma and crisis for the majority of my initial full-time career with the Snoqualmie tribe in Washington. And then when I decided that I really wanted a more rural location to live in that was conducive to the work I do and really who I am authentically, came to Alaska.
Mhm.
And now am working as a substance abuse counselor for the Army. So uh, aside from my life experience, there is the academic perspective, but then honestly, my clients teach me, their life experience teaches me so much
Mm.
about this particular subject. And so, yes, academics are very much uh, a support in our healing, and they guide us and inform us. But I think the bulk of the effectiveness of therapy comes from life experience, ours
Mm.
and our clients, and applying that and learning from that. So that is
Kathleen,
my back.
that was you have a really interesting uh, story, and it's I'm so excited to go into this, and thank you for sharing that so openly and honestly. The dual roles of the objective academic side of it and the subjective. In many ways, I feel that this is the way that we're headed to really truly be able to heal and integrate, is really giving face value to both of those aspects.
For myself, I find it really important to, and I'm going to go to the next slide, really talk about the definitions, right? Like to have a common language, because for some of us, some of these terms mean different things. And so, in order to kind of really have a really clear discussion, I just wanted to give you my perspective on what I mean by these terms. And by all means, if either of you want to ask a question or clarify so that before we move forward, please let's do that. So the first one, trauma, right? We're all very familiar with this word, not just from a definition perspective, but from an experiential perspective. Um, and we have different types of trauma. We have developmental trauma, trauma that we experience in our development as an individual from birth until adulthood. And then and this often coincides, but repetitive trauma, trauma that is consistent and ongoing. It's not a singular event, it's an experience of daily life for an extended period of time. Um, and we might call that complex trauma because it's more than just a singular event, it is compounded over time. And then we do have singular events. We have natural disasters. We have loss. There may be, we have assaults, right? Violence. So sometimes they are singular events, but nonetheless, they are still traumatic experiences. And then an important piece of what we're going to talk about in terms of addiction is when we do experience trauma, is there or do we or have we had the presence or absence of a support system when we've experienced that trauma? So do we have a mentor or a guide, or have we had our own uh, um, post-traumatic growth to the point where we can process, or we have therapy, but in some way, shape, or form we can process what we've experienced, regain a sense of grounding and safety and meaning in what's happened, right? If that isn't there, that's when we move on to what we will see or talk about primarily in this is addiction. Um, so first, does anyone have any questions or want to say anything about that definition of trauma, or want clarification on that?
No, I think that was very clear to me, Kathy.
Okay, great. So the other thing I want to mention about the word trauma is because we have thankfully grown in the world of mental health around the therapeutic modalities and the ways that we treat and work and process trauma. It's also become a buzzword in society where it's become somewhat desensitized. Oh yeah, everybody experiences trauma, no big deal, right? Just move on with it. So um it's it so when we talk particularly about developmental trauma where there's neglect, or maybe not overt physical abuse, but just isolation or lack of affection, right? Nobody's abusing the child, but they're ignored or not given affection. That is trauma. That will lead to similar symptoms and potentially addictions, just as if there was
Mhm.
overt abuse or obvious signs of trauma. Uh,
Does it make sense to you? Something that I've kind of just witnessed, and I'm just curious your opinion, is that a lot that seems to be coming to light currently are the aspects of the covert trauma, more of the emotional and not overt aspect of it. And
Yes, we are definitely starting to recognize that for sure. And I'm again very positive, or feeling very positive about that. But I do know, like, particularly in social media circles, and sometimes even in the the media in other ways, not social media, but in the way that some sources, that we might listen to, perhaps, again, social media is Facebook, but we may hear people talk about trauma in a way that, like they are not giving it the credence or the value that is in the experience of those who do have or have been through um trauma that is not very obvious, right? That is more covert, right? So um it's still something, well, the field of mental health in general, we are still removing stigmas. We
Mhm.
are still working towards seeing it equally as valid as physical conditions,
Right.
and physical diagnoses. Yes, we are making a great deal of progress. We're far ahead of where we were, but definitely still see the room to grow. So, um, for some folks, it is still um, the message they're getting from society that, well, if you weren't actually physically abused or sexually abused, or again, very overt forms of trauma, that they might feel like, well, no, I've not really been traumatized, or that
Mhm.
wasn't really
Mhm.
traumatic. I've had service members or clients come in and tell me that, no, I haven't been abused. But then when we dig into the information and they talk about the neglect and um or the different aspects of lack of nurturing, they're like, that's trauma.
Yeah, I'm glad that you described that. That was really great. And before we move on, it is something that I've heard and witnessed myself, is that there's somehow on the spectrum a feeling of less than significant because it wasn't overt. And I'm just kind of curious too how you talked about the developmental or the repetitive, is that I think I'm just so interested in the physiology and how an overt sudden trauma affects the physiology, and the importance of really understanding, like you said, the developmental or repetitive aspects of the trauma within the physiology and the psyche. And to me, it would seem that actually they're just two ends of the same spectrum, and that one is not necessarily more critical than the other, so to speak. But I'm also kind of curious, not just physiologically, but if there needs to be different ways to integrate those opposite phenomenons of trauma. It'll be interesting as time proceeds to kind of see if they need to be addressed differently.
Absolutely. And I do have, we will, in the presentation, talking about the neurobiology and
Great.
biochemistry of trauma, which again does inform how we work with processing trauma, given the type of trauma um, that the individual has experienced.
Thank you.
Yes. So coming to the understanding of what I mean by addiction and chemical dependency, and those being two different things. So addiction is rooted in, or the foundation of it is trauma. We develop coping skills and behaviors to survive a traumatic experience. If we don't have that presence of support to help us process our trauma, we will find whatever is available that we can that we sense will help us get through it to survive. And it actually becomes a survival mechanism. So it's like breathing, eating. um it is not a matter of willpower. It literally, psychologically, we are convinced that without this particular addiction, whatever that may be, and we'll talk about the different forms in shortly, that we will not survive without it. And so the behaviors that we often see with addiction, and in the extreme forms, we see individuals who are willing to give up anything and everything in order to continue with the behavior that they feel is necessary for their survival. So the difference between addiction and chemical dependency, we can use a particular form of addiction. And again, it's not going to just be alcohol and drugs. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But when we use that often enough, the body can start to incorporate that substance or that behavior in a way that we use it to function. It's like the body has now adapted to this particular behavior or substance as a part of doing what we need to do. And so withdrawing that literally leads to withdrawal. If we remove that substance, our body will physically um, go into a state of perhaps a shock. Often it's the nervous system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later too, but really substances affecting our nervous system and the biochemistry. And suddenly we've got to rebalance, and the body has to figure out how to do what it used to do without that. Now, so we will talk about the neurobiology now, but oftentimes when we use a particular um, behavior or substance to survive, doing that long enough will often lead to chemical dependency. So often we will have someone who is experiencing addiction and chemical dependency at the same time, but they don't have to be. So that they can be two separate things. So how does trauma affect our biochemistry? Even one experience of trauma will induce the fight, flight, or freeze response. And if you have any questions about that, please let me know and we'll talk more about that. But chemically, when we experience a stressful, particularly traumatic situation, we release chemicals into our system, cortisol, adrenaline. And one of the effects of these chemicals that are released in order to get us to fight, flee, or freeze, chemicals will, as they fill and filter through the body, coming into the brain, cortisol will attach to the hippocampus. Hippocampus is the organ that's responsible for memory. When the hippocampus is flooded with cortisol, it interferes with the ability for us to fully record and have a full memory of the experience. It's a survival mechanism. So some individuals will have no memory at all, and some will have only a few details that they remember. And an important part of this is why we get triggered, right? So if we only remember a few details or none at all, and as a caveat, our body remembers everything. Physiologically, we remember the trauma, and subconsciously, there is memory, not a conscious memory, not a retrievable memory at that moment. So something comes into our awareness in the present. One of those few details that we do remember, or even if we don't remember anything, our body is, recording those triggers. It will induce that same sense of fear and the fight, flight, or freeze response, because our body believes we're in the exact same situation, that same traumatic situation. It can't distinguish between the past and the present. So as we'll talk about later, one of the important parts of processing trauma is reconstructing or putting a context back into our experience of trauma, so that, in other words, in the present, everything would have to be the same. It would have to be the exact same situation in order to have that traumatic response. Those triggers become desensitized because they're not enough to induce the response. So those chemicals, that biochemistry is affected, and what will happen over time with developmental or repetitive trauma is our body becomes in a constant state of alert. Our amygdala is hypersensitive. We are easily placed in this state of needing to fight, flight, or freeze, and needing to reach out for whatever coping skills that we do have. And if we have not developed the ability to process our trauma with either others or ourselves, addiction or the use of a substance, and then eventually addiction may become part of our way of coping long term. So that is the beginnings, I would say, of potential addiction or chemical dependency when we on our own with our left on our own are looking for a way to cope with our experience of trauma. Any questions? This I wanted to share with you because you may be familiar with Gabor Mate and his work, and he has brought the discussion and the treatment of trauma, I believe, to um, a new level of compassion and empathy, and a way of understanding addiction and seeing it as a means of survival. And not only that, as we will get into in a little bit, addiction does have its place in terms of surviving. We may, in the moment or for a period of time, it may actually get us through when there isn't anything else available. And so having a completely negative view of addiction and saying, oh, I don't like the words good or bad, that it's something that you should be ashamed of, or that you should look at as a part of yourself and say, wow, I have to get rid of you. Looking at it as no, actually, that part of us, and again, we'll get into this, that addictive part that is trying to help us survive. Any part of us that's ever done anything to help us survive a situation or help us, in a sense, we should have gratitude for. And and I'll explain further exactly where I'm going with that, or what I mean by that. But
Mhm.
I'd like to just go through this initial excerpt from his book, in the realm of hungry ghosts. So he says here, the mandala, the Buddhist wheel of life, revolves through 6 realms. Each realm is populated by characters representing aspects of the human existence, our various ways of being. In the beast realm, we're driven by basic survival instincts and appetites such as physical hunger and sexuality, what Freud called the id. The denizens of the hell realm are trapped in states of unbearable rage and anxiety. In the God realm, we transcend our troubles and our egos through sensual, aesthetic, or religious experience, but only temporarily in an ignorance of spiritual truth. Even this enviable state is tinged with loss and suffering. The inhabitants of the hungry ghost realm are depicted as creatures with scrawny necks, small mouths, emaciated limbs, and large, bloated, empty bellies. This is the domain of addiction, where we constantly seek something outside ourselves to curb an insatiable yearning for relief or fulfillment. The aching emptiness is perpetual because the substances, objects, or pursuits we hope will soothe it are not what we really need. We don't know what we need, and so long as we stay in the hungry ghost mode, we'll never know. We haunt our lives without being fully present. Some people dwell much of their lives in one realm or another. Many of us move back and forth between them, perhaps through all of them in the course of a single day. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's profound how he's able to call out the duality of like the extremes of maybe the escapes that we have as human beings, from the very materialistic state, and then to the very spiritual state. How you know it just really proves that we're all still very much learning. And I love his very clear description, and how he emphasizes that even in a single day, we can experience so many of these. So it just really makes me want to forgive myself again for questioning the reasons why I don't have it all figured out. So it's very beautiful.
It is. It is. And just to reconnect it to the biochemistry and neurobiology. So the experience of trauma and how it affects our nervous system. So when he's talking about relief, when we are overwhelmed, substances often will dampen the nervous system, the reaction of the anxiety and the emotions
Mm.
that are too painful to bear. And often those painful emotions are rooted in a sense of lack, right? Or that we are lacking as an individual, and so we do certain behaviors that we would call addictive in order to counter that feeling of not being enough, right? So working with our physiology, the vagus nerve, for instance, in polyvagal theory, if and again, if anybody has any questions on
Mm.
that and they want to ask at any point, please do. But um, working to working with our body, and so somatic experiencing and how to induce a state of relaxation, and again provide a healthy coping skills with managing the biochemical, the physiological reaction of trauma.
In my days of teaching yoga and getting to know so many of my clients and friends, I didn't have the full awareness of what working with the somatic experience on such a profound level has the ability to bring up. And at some point, one of the reasons why I stopped teaching was because I realized that we were getting very deeply, over long periods of time, into some of these expressions of psychological trauma were starting to present themselves. And at some point, I realized as the yoga instructor that I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse with some of the things that actually are arising as so far as their trauma experience. Now, at the time, I did the best that I could, and I understood. I could see and witness and observe what was happening. But at some point, I realized that my yoga teaching was turning into this sort of blend of life coaching and spiritual mentorship. And then at some point, I could see that this psyche was requiring this opposite perspective of the knowledge and cognitive and objective reality around their trauma that I actually didn't have the expertise in to be able to take them through that next level of integration. So I think it's just so very interesting. And I think that we are entering a time where the science and the spirituality can really benefit from working and parlaying off of each other's experience. And on the other end is working with the healthcare industry right now, is there tends to be that opposite polarity where there's a really in-depth awareness of the neurobiology and the scientific aspect of it. But then in terms of them starting to open into this more elusive or mysterious realm of the spiritual aspect of things, they could use a little bit of help maybe with some of the people who are more invested in that realm. So it's kind of exciting to see what the future holds with these two polarities. I'm sure there's many aspects of the spectrum, but if you just take, this maybe the science minded people or the objective minded, the left brain minded people, as opposed to maybe the right brain minded people, and maybe for us to help integrate, we can have more of these collaborations. I kind of see that a little bit within you and I. So kind of excited for that experience instead of us sh- shaming or fighting the other and saying that we're right and you're wrong. Actually, I think we both have something valuable to bring to the table. So
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. Um, and I see it, my clients and in what I'm doing now, my service members responding. Like I invite in my work with them the opportunity for them to explore that aspect of their experience, which is not common for them to have that type of um, discussion, that aspect of the discussion of what they're experiencing, and
Right.
I see them respond very positively, and it definitely, you know, promotes their ability to have insight and for growth, and increases the probability of their being able to um, recover, from addiction or chemical dependency, because they have the insight now of the root cause, and how that affects that aspect of themselves, that the spiritual aspect, which again I think in scientific with science we are coming back to a integration of the two, so that don't see them as separate things. And as a side note, there was a point in history, particularly in the Greek culture, where that was just common knowledge. In other words, or the knowledge really was an incorporation of science and what we think of as spirituality today, and the inner self and being. So now I want to talk about internal family systems. Okay.
Right.
So, internal family systems is a modality of therapy that really helps us to recognize our addictions and how we can communicate with them. And so this will become more clear as we discuss it, but as I mentioned before, that addictive part, like we do have parts. We have aspects of ourselves that we that are developed during our experience and shortly after of trauma, as a means to survive it, to cope with it. And again, if we have the presence of a healthy support system or a guide, like, those parts will tend to be healthy parts, really actually more our core self, right? In other words, we will quickly reconnect to the core of us, our core self, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But in other words, we won't have protective parts that are feeling like they constantly need to be active in order to protect us, to take care of us, to m- mitigate or manage the perceived sense of lack of safety that the traumatic experience has induced or evoked. So the internal family systems was developed because Dick Schwartz is the therapist's name, and he was doing family work with families, and was seeing the family as a whole improve, but there'd still be at least one member who would seem to be struggling. And when he would over time interview or work with the individual to find a kind of look into why they were still struggling, they would often use vocabulary and words and phrases like, well, yeah, I'm getting along better with my mom and dad, but there's this part of me that dot dot dot. Okay, so they could be talking about their eating disorder or something else that is basically an addictive behavior. A survival skill is still continuing to occur. And so when he really researched this, he came up with internal family systems as a way of working with individuals and their trauma. And the core of it, and no pun intended, because I'm not talking about the core self of it, but the foundation of it is that we have protective parts, managers and firefighters, that are doing their best to keep us separate from what we call the exiles, those wounded parts of us, those the child, or as an adult where we've been so wounded that it's so painful and we've had no one there to help us process it in any way, or did not already have the skills, that the only way to manage that pain and woundedness is to separate that part from ourselves. And we develop then these behaviors as either managers or firefighters to keep those exiles exiled. Um, so here's where we're going to start to see some of the faces of addiction, in general, whether it be men or women, that we develop as managers or firefighters um, to keep those exiles at bay. So as this says here, the main job of a manager is to, like, keep the status quo, be able to do what we need to do every day, look acceptable to the outside world, right? And um, as close to what the core self, like kind of looking like the core self, but not being it, actually got rooted in that. It creates an illusion of safety, right? And often, what our managers will do is be our inner critic and say, well, you can't do this, or we can't do that, or we start to label ourselves. And as it says, uses self-sufficiency to prevent humiliation and abandonment. So the exiles that we are working to protect ourselves from or keep at bay are often those exiles who've experienced extreme humiliation and abandonment. And so we work really hard to prevent ourselves from feeling that. And we give ourselves a false sense of security through that. So it talks about examples: people pleasing, perfectionists, um, forms of self sabotage. We'll feel anxiety. There may be, and rather than being a overachiever, we also may be a procrastinator, which is sort of self sabotaging, right? Or caretaking, and we'll talk more about that later in the terms of how we as women express or addictions may manifest. So any questions on that particular part, the manager part? Okay. Firefighters are the ones who jump into action and where we really see addiction come into play. When we are so triggered, and again, with complex trauma, repetitive trauma, developmental trauma, which is often repetitive, it's not a singular event, we will develop parts that will reach out, and because we become or develop a constant state of vigilance, right? And waiting, feeling like we are on the verge of a threat, and so constantly needing to reach out for a coping skill. And if it is a substance, we may then experience addiction and potentially chemical dependency. So firefighters come and put out they're squashing the pain, right? We get triggered, we're overwhelmed. We need to stop that. We cannot feel that. We cannot go there. That exile cannot come into our awareness or come any closer. So we reach for things such as overspending, overeating, addiction, obsession, video games and media binges, social media. And again, we'll talk more about that. But anger is one of those things that we may, for men though, in particular, really can be a way of expressing um, what they're feeling without touching or working with the exile, right? They're projecting it outward. It's also really, for men, actually more of a sign of depression than isolating or not being able or motivated to do things. So for a lot of folks, that may seem counterintuitive, that for someone who's very depressed, that they're very, very angry and aggressive. But particularly for men, that often seems to be an expression of that. Any questions about firefighters?
Yes, I have two things. One is, could we link this, like you said, for men, the masculine, kind of the usurped masculine energy within women? Because I see, like, I feel that there's a lot of kind of inversion or confusion around gender identity right now. And I know that I'm seeing almost this opposite phenomenon where there's more angry women. And I'm wondering if this relates to that. And then my last thing I wanted to say is, this the exile or the part that would kind of organize staunch mental compartmentalization? Like, I can't feel that. I got to put that over here. I got to put that over here.
Again, these are only guides and a way of working with parts. And often we can, some of the behaviors that we develop to protect ourselves can sort of transition between manager and fighter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not concrete and it's not
Right.
always distinct. So yes, basically the answer is yes.
Mhm.
Um, Often we see compartmentalization as a way to manage our experience. However, when we are suddenly presented with a trigger, we may stuff that into a compartment right away,
Mhm.
right? Like so, and how we
Give it to
might
the
do that,
manager. Yeah.
right? Could be through the manager, or it could be a substance or something when we take that automatically puts that in that box, right? Or separates us from it. Um, so yeah, they often blend. But what they don't want or allowed to blend is the exile. That has to stay out there.
Right,
So
right.
the core goal of internal family systems is integration, is taking these parts and first of all, befriending them, not criticizing them, not telling those parts that they are bad. It's to thank them for their service, but to now communicate with them and integrate them in back into the core. So to where our core self is now the lead. It's driving the bus, so to speak. And the parts, if necessary, are available. Some of them might decide to retire after certain conversations, but or some go on vacation, et cetera, reduce their hours, um, but the core self is the one who's in charge.
Kathy,
Um,
really quick, I have a friend who works with internal family systems, and she kind of cleverly has brought awareness to these parts of her, and she actually has given them names. And
mhm,
she has this ability to really be in communion when they arise. And I've recognized that within myself, and it's such a way to address these aspects of ourselves, like you said, without shaming them or blaming them, and really realizing that this is something that we do to help us survive from the trauma.
100%. And you brought up something really crucial in the work of processing trauma, which is the experience of shame. And guilt is a part of that, but often, again, with definitions, guilt may be more about I realize that something that I have been a part of or done has caused myself or someone else harm, and I feel some remorse about that. I want to change that. And we can often think of that as guilt. And that hopefully is really temporary and really if it's not, that's where we come into shame, right? Shame is more of a perspective we have about ourselves that is ongoing and is damaging and prevents us from growing, and really is connected to we talk about forgiveness a lot, right, in the world of both mental health but in spirituality, and that's forgiveness isn't really for anybody else, it's for ourselves to release shame
Mhm.
and anger and being stuck and the emotions that are not serving us in a healthy
Because
way.
that'll
So
continue to project out when we feel a moment where we need to, come into the system right here, or bring one of these managers or firefighters to the forefront. At least for myself, I've experienced that if I don't forgive myself around certain things, when I'm triggered for whatever reason, it's still there. It's like it will unconsciously try to drive the bus again. So
absolutely,
forgiveness for me has been at the forefront of my continuation of my healing process.
yes, absolutely. So yeah, thank you for saying that and sharing that. It's that forgiveness is a whole nother discussion subject that we could spend a lot of time on, but it is definitely like a core part of of this work and what we're talking about. So just before we move on, that core self, I love how, again, this system isn't really telling us anything new, but it is giving us a vocabulary and a framework and a way to visualize and work with trauma in a way that is much more tangible for individuals, I think, than many other ways of working with trauma. So the way they describe the core self and its qualities. So when we're trying to decide and discern when it's a part that's in charge or our core self, like they call them the 8 C's, but they're like a litmus test for, are we in our core? If we're calm, confident, curious, centered, creative, playful, well, they're coming up with some other C's, but adventurous and stable. Like the when we are in that state, we can be pretty, again, there's the word confident, but assured, right, that we are working from our core, that our core is in charge.
Mm,
So I just bring that up because I really enjoy this about IFS and how that helps individuals to kind of,
mhm.
when they are working with parts, understand if they are fully in their core yet, because sometimes we can be working with the part and think, oh yeah, that's the self, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. I love that description of these 8 C's that you're discussing. Some of those qualities remind me of the framework that I often have used to help me in my integration, which is the right and left hemisphere of the brain, or the masculine and feminine energy, so to speak. These terms are a beautiful blend of the dichotomy of both of those strengths of both sides of the brain. So I think that's great.
Mhm. Yes, and in the description in the center, where it says, it spontaneously emerges when we are centered and truly safe. And so we'll get to that near the end, but safety is key. And when we are in our core, we are truly grounded and being like, yeah, I know the storm's coming, but I know it's not going to take me away. I'm good, right?
Yeah.
But when we experience trauma, our safety's ripped away. And ultimately that's what we're searching for. But we'll kind of,
Mm.
we will get back to that. Okay. So um I'm moving my screen around because it's covering things up. Okay. Forms of addiction. So, yes, substances are often the first thing we think of, alcohol and drugs. But honestly, addiction is so much more prevalent than we think because food, sex, work, because work provides us with a sense of power and control, and often that's linked to status and money. Even exercise, and then we talked about electronics, social media, games. And then I just put in others. Is there anything other things you can think of that you've witnessed or experienced as a form of addiction?
I think one thing that is coming to the forefront in the spiritual community, because there has been such a prevalence towards the internal aspects of healing, that an addiction that I see arising, it may not be new, is actually the addiction to healing, where there's a hypervigilance that they cannot just relax because they're still not there yet. So that's one thing that I'm really seeing play out in aspects of my community. So again, it's just taking something that's really positive, but then actually never allowing yourself that core those core principles that you just discussed, of like feeling safe enough to relax and have fun, because I'm not there yet, I can't relax because I'm still healing. That just a chronic addiction to the healing process as well.
Hmm. Yes, well said. And when we get further along, there is a connection that you'll see to that. But thank you.
Mhm.
Female energy and addiction. So, identity and attachment, our hungry ghosts. Okay. So, motherhood is one area in which I personally have experienced some addiction, and have had other women tell me the same, where we become so overly identified to our role as a mother. We give up who we are authentically. Often we place value on ourselves based on how much or how well we perform as a mother and as a caretaker, right? So we've used that word before. um and then another is, and we'll expand and hopefully have discussion on these as I go through them. Relationships, so seeking safety. For me, this has been huge in my life. I'm 56 now, and it's only, I would say, in the last 3 years, maybe even a little less, that I would say I really have no inclination or compulsion, really an addiction to seeing another individual to be in a relationship as necessary to be safe or supported or secure.
Mm.
And I think still, even with all of the, I guess I would say, I guess we could say progress. I'm a little leery to use that word, but as women,
Mm.
how we have moved away from just the automatic social expectation that we have a partner, they take care of us, our role was more defined. Even with that being less of an expectation, I think there's still an internal unspoken expectation from like transgenerational trauma
Mhm.
to, and that's, oh, we didn't really talk about that. So we will, but um so there's this need of like, you know what, I can't do this on my own. I'm not really strong enough, capable enough. I need a partner to make sure that I'm going to be okay. Did that for way too long, in my past. Self-care and physical expression. So we can kind of liken this to the self-care part. Like we think of exercise, or maybe we're certain pampering things we do for ourselves, like getting our nails done and our hair done, but also that can be like the way we might present ourselves physically, whether it be how we look physically, like with exercise, having certain body type or definition, or what kind of clothes we wear. Again, how we present physically we can sometimes be so addicted to that aspect of ourselves as a way of not addressing what's happening interiorly, right? Um, Work roles. So similar to family dynamics, where we have in the family, we have a scapegoat, we have a peacemaker, right? As certain members of the family take on certain roles, there can be an addiction to that identity that we have in the workplace. And so I don't know if for anyone who's experienced like a work environment where you have coworkers, I have certainly witnessed where certain individuals will take on roles as a means. It fills a need in some way for them to behave in certain ways. Sometimes they're the happy, cheerful one who's always going around and starting conversations, and it's like a little over the top. Then we have individuals who are, wow, they're super negative. They're critical, and so you know what I'm talking about, right? And make it and then dogma. Can become addicted and dependent upon dogmas. And so, like you mentioned, religion or spirituality, and I do separate those two things. Like the spirituality is, to me, it indicates that aspect of ourselves that's connected to something more, whether we call it God or the divine, whatever term may resonate with us. Religions are organized ways to engage our spirituality, hopefully promote it and nurture it. But often, if we look at history, religions, particularly, westernized religions, have created a political system. It's a hierarchy, it's rules. It's not really so much about the spirituality anymore as it is a means of power and control. So another whole presentation we could do is on that particular subject. And just a quick side note, so for instance, during the Roman Empire, when Catholicism became, or Christianity became, the religion, a state religion, so to speak, it was Constantine the emperor who decided that he was backing the winning horse. This wasn't about him believing in Christ over paganism. It was, okay, I'm going to get more people to do what I say if I back Christianity.
Mhm.
And the synoptic gospels were developed or chosen by Constantine's basically panel who put the Bible together in
Mhm.
order to reinforce his message of, or to support his power and control through the religion.
Yeah, this identity politics now, and what you're talking about, it makes me feel that somewhere along the line, man has a problem scaling things. Like if something stays small, like a mom and pop store, it seems that it's less pernicious and prone to dynamics like corruption and all sorts of other issues that arise. But it seems like when we get scaling occurring and more people, it's just that the pernicious nature of, like you said, the power and the money and the authority just consumes the soul, I guess.
Hmm. And it is again, no pun intended, but a powerful way
Hmm.
to distract and avoid from going interiorly, right? Like we
Hmm.
are controlling out in the world, which gives us a false sense of control for ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, and besides politics and religion, there's the social issues. So all of these things, we as women in particular, might start to embody some of what we think of, like you said, mentioned before, more of what were considered male aspects or male energy. We're becoming very aggressive, or, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but we become very so invested that we have a lot of charged energy
Hmm.
around an identification then with these issues.
Hmm.
And we're like we become, maybe even the word zealous, right? Like in
Hmm.
terms of a religion or our political beliefs, or an aspect of social justice or issues. And we have an identity then connected to that, right? um,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
attached to it. And so like our hungry ghosts, like they're looking to fill a need or find relief. And
Hmm.
by becoming attached or identifying with these things, we're filling a need, right?
Yeah.
Often.
I think
So
that's
and
also the like one of the dangers is from doing internal work personally or with a mentor one-on-one. When we I've seen like what is it called? There's a book, I think it's by Douglas Murray, called The Madness of Crowds, is like a lot of times if we hook in to a particular system with many people, it's to kind of affirm the trauma, and it keeps us away from turning in. So interesting.
yes. And one of the most, I would say, prevalent experiences of trauma when it comes to developmental trauma is the lack of attachment, that nurturing, and that connection that's needed when we are so very young from birth, right? Um, that we will seek attachment then in
Mhm.
other ways, and that sense of belonging and connectedness, and these types of forms of addiction can fill that need, fill that desire for attachment, and then reinforcing a sense of identity, which is like affirmation, right? Validation, feeling.
Yeah. Kathy, something else that's just coming up really quick is when we do what you just said, we confirm the identity and the label, and then we have a scale, a group around us that's it's almost like ossifying this identity to where it reminds me of what you said earlier, where you have a trauma and the chemicals hijack an area of the brain where like you become limited in your vision, like from kind of like from a spiritual perspective. I'm feeling this as like we lose vision to be able to cultivate the space to have Socratic discussion with our opposite, because we continue to like ossify our group, our identity, our persona to feel safe in that group. That it feels to me that that's a contributing factor to the reason why we're having such a difficult time communicating with compassion to people who are outside of our perceived insulary or familial identity, even in like a workplace.
Yes, yes. And one other aspect of um, biochemistry and neurobiology connected to trauma, and this is really relevant in the moment because I'm sharing my ADHD with you
Mhm.
because I'm going back to another subject. So I bounce back and forth. But trauma will biochemically also affect our brain chemistry such that we can not produce enough dopamine and norepinephrine and some other chemicals that are necessary for optimal functioning,
Mm.
regulation of our nervous system as well. So it's another aspect of affecting the nervous system. But we need dopamine and we need norepinephrine. We need these chemicals. But the experience, particularly the repetitive experience of trauma, will dampen the brain's production of these chemicals. And so physiologically speaking, our body is asking for it. Hey, I need more of this. How do we get it? Well, we
Mm.
can get it in healthy means through
Mhm.
exercise or various different things we do for ourselves. We can increase our dopamine levels. But what's really easy, if we don't have anybody else to guide us or we have no experience of how to do that for ourselves, substances.
Yeah, so there has to be an awareness that cultivates to really start to integrate. Mhm.
And sometimes the cart comes before the horse in the sense
Mhm.
that we do have individuals who are born with a
Mm.
natural deficit in the ability in dopamine or epinephrine that they don't actually their brain doesn't from the beginning produce enough. And we could argue that perhaps many of these individuals actually experience some developmental trauma.
Mm.
Some, for instance, Gabor Mate talks about how in Western society it is has been for a very long time so normal when a child is born, when they're brought home, they're like, "Oh, don't coddle them, don't they're crying, you gotta put them in there, let them cry for a while till they learn to fall asleep on their own." We're traumatizing them. So, even those things at birth can start to change the biochemistry of the brain, and so why we may have even seen or identified what we call now ADHD in children can be really linked to developmental trauma as well. But whatever the foundational source of the change in biochemistry, there you have it. So addiction may present as a need to compensate for what the body is not producing. Maybe not because of trauma. It could be a medical condition, but nonetheless, addiction can spring from that as well.
Before we go on, one last thing is that I'm just coming from my illness background. Um, if I could leave the world with one message from my experience, it would be that if we could stop demonizing the maladaptations in a way where it's like, oh, your body's doing something wrong, your body's doing something wrong, because I think that does something I've seen so many times that reinstigate a trauma response from an individual who maybe somewhere along that line upstream had some additional psychological, emotional, chemical issues that maybe even had contributed to the malfunction of the physical body. And when we have providers who are just strictly focused on a science in the way of this is wrong, what your body is doing is wrong, and we have to fight this. And I understand that aspect, but I think that there needs to be room for the fact that a lot of times these maladaptations and things that are going on are a way to survive because we're lacking or something else needs to be addressed upstream. So,
Yes, beautiful point. Beautifully said. I tell my clients this all the time. There's nothing wrong with you.
mhm,
There's nothing wrong with you.
mhm,
You are doing what you need to do to survive. It's what you know how to do. And particularly with, or I would say particularly, but also with ADHD is a form of neurodiversity for those who are that, if their brains just naturally have never really produced those chemicals in the proper amounts for proper functioning. It's just their brains are different. They're not bad or wrong. They're just different. Autism is a form of neurodiversity. They're different, diverse, not bad or wrong. And
mhm,
those individuals just need how to work with that so that they can do what they want to do. It's not like we're trying to say you have to be quote unquote normal or different. Now, we may need to compensate just like we will with diabetes. You may have to take insulin. With ADHD, you may need some chemical assistance. But certainly without therapy or treatment of any kind, individuals with ADHD will reach for substances very often to compensate for the lack of dopamine and norepinephrine. And we find scientifically once they are treated and they don't reach for substance and they are not dependent upon those substances anymore, either physically or psychologically.
Man, Kathleen, if we could just find a way to not hand out the pill immediately, unless it's like that's the
Yes.
only option, right? Or it's come to that point, and also include this. I mean, that possibly feels like it would be incredible, but obviously we're not there yet, but I would love that.
Yeah, my oldest son has pretty significant ADHD, and he's kind of run the gambit from as a teenager self-medicating to having medication temporarily as an adult, and then being like, no, neither of those are what I want for my
Mm,
body. And now he's goes in nature all the time. He mountain climbs. For him, that's his therapy. So yes, we can increase dopamine with therapeutic interventions,
mhm.
and also tools in how to work with our brains that operate, perceive things differently, so that we can still do what we need to do. Um, and medication is not always necessary. Um, there are new medications out now that aren't stimulants, which is a good thing.
Mhm.
They're so and have been tried for some time and appear to be very safe. But again, we don't really want medication to be the first line of defense. We really needs to go individual by individual and see what's necessary, right?
Yeah, the personalized care, and I'm in love with what you were talking about with your son, that this room for a journey within our perceived illnesses or shortcomings, that you may need this now, you may need this now, and have this open door, continue to keep the door open to an additional third way, right? Like you may need medication, you may not, but maybe it's actually something altogether different. And I think that comes through, is birthed through the individual's awareness. And I think if providers could impart this aspect of it more, and again, not ossify the diagnosis, I think it would give people more of an opportunity to have permission to do this deeper intrinsic work.
Absolutely. And one thing I would add, and this is in Gabor Mate's work, and it's been used in Canada and Europe for a very long time now, is psilocybin
Mm,
and the use of that particular medication therapeutically. It is transforming
mm,
the therapeutic world for individuals who do have access to it.
mhm,
Um, it is providing not the therapist provides the safe outer space.
mhm.
Psilocybin appear to create the safe space inwardly.
So,
And
Kathleen, what would you say to somebody who maybe had a chemical dependency and then it's suggested for them to do psilocybin when they're trying to stay away from any sort of drugs?
well, I would offer that anything can be a drug:
Mhm,
food, sex, work.
mhm,
We just because food is legal doesn't mean that people don't use it, or can't use it as a means to create dopamine within their body and
mhm.
to alter their state. Psychedelics used in a therapeutic manner, are not scientifically, we're not seeing that becoming an addiction,
Yeah,
right?
so it's more of a almost like revisiting the demon in a different way where there's a non-dependency toward it then.
Yeah, in fact, it tends to reduce the need for other substances or to be addicted. So there, from the research and also my experience with clients who've used psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, which I will say is much more showing to be much more effective than like ketamine, which is synthetic.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
but the research is showing that individuals will be able to work with and process their trauma in such a way that there's not a desire to reach for substances as a means to cope. They're processing. They are getting regrounded. They're having a sense of safety and such a strong connection to core,
Hmm.
their self,
Hmm.
that there isn't a need for those protective parts, particularly the firefighters, right, to jump into action and numb them out or cope with what they've experienced that still has not been resolved.
One last question regarding psilocybin. Do you feel that there's a potential that it's linked to the Western culture mindset of being very detached from the spiritual self and more matter based and related, or left brain related? um, this has now maybe made a an appearance as a replacement for, to get into the deep, long connection that maybe a spiritual process would normally take on. Because, for instance, I lived the majority of my life doing spiritual work, and I had the time and the desire to really do internal work for many, many, many years. And one thing I hear from a lot of perceived professionals or mothers or is like, I don't have 10 years to dedicate my life to do spiritual transformation. And I'm just wondering if, like, there's a little bit of a link between how we live here in the West potentially, and using psilocybin as a way to reconnect with the spiritual, because we've been really disconnected from it for maybe a long time.
Yeah, and if I understand you correctly, yes, Western society still frowns upon or places a natural substances and a connection to the spiritual uh, as second class. Like it's not as valid.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And also we tend to look for quick fixes. Like
Hmm.
our Western society is definitely, how can I do this the fastest? I
Hmm.
really just want to get it done. Like, Ozempic now, right? And
Yeah.
right. So there is that aspect of it for sure. But also one thing that we can't discount is big pharma and uh the pharmaceuticals. They don't like natural substances. They don't like things that they don't have to produce and get people to pay them money
On a
for.
long-term basis, as a long-term customer.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's a possibility that pharma is going to try to come in and hijack the the world of psychedelics?
I think it's probably definitely going to come down the road. I mean, I think in the near term, they're just going to continue to lobby to have it not legal. I mean, Oregon seems to have skirted all of that. Like you can do whatever you want in Oregon now.
Mhm.
um, but um, but yes, I think they're going to first try to keep it as, yeah, no, this is an illicit substance, like LSD or other things. Like, we can't have this. Then I think eventually the research, is showing. I mean, they already started using ketamine now in clinics in the US. They are authorizing that. But again, I am not seeing the same or research showing, and I have had some. Even my son Nick tried ketamine when he was in a clinic for his anxiety and depression.
Mhm.
Not as effective.
Yeah, I know somebody who experienced, a younger gentleman who experienced, he's still recovering with what they call a K-hole. So it was almost
Oh,
that it took him to a different place psychologically, and he is worse off than he was beforehand. And that's individual, his experience, his root causes. But like you said, it's synthetic, and I don't know, but it's not an end all be all for sure for everybody, because this young gentleman is really suffering, after having tried many Western therapies, including traditional, psychiatric help, traditional psychiatric medication. And then somebody said, let's try the ketamine. And now he's actually worse off. And in his mind, what's difficult is in his own mind, he's trying to express that he feels the ketamine is what made him worse. And he's not getting that validation from the
right.
professionals. And I think that this is creating more frustration within him, trying to work through his own subjective experience of healing.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history of ketamine. Ketamine was developed in Vietnam during the
Mm,
Vietnam era. It
mm,
was meant to assist soldiers from going into shock to the point where
mm.
they would die. So if they're wounded on the battlefield, they need to get them to a MASH unit or to medical get medical attention. Soldiers were dying on the way from the
Shock.
shock. Ketamine causes enough dissociation, right,
Yeah,
that
that's,
they
yep.
can survive that interim period, and so it has its place, but being dissociated alone and in and of itself is not going to provide, in my opinion, and the research seems to support this.
Then, yeah, the conscious way back has to be a part of the therapeutic protocol, right?
Absolutely, and so what we're seeing now is where I should put this delicately, where one can engage with a therapist and use psilocybin and be guided. And there are, if anyone wants more information, I do know of very reputable, valid, vetted agencies that will connect you with therapists. Some will come to you. Some folks go to Oregon, where most of them are,
Mhm.
and be a guide through a ceremonial therapeutic session, but then also guide you on how to microdose um, as well. And then they have trusted sources from where to purchase, the psilocybin. So um, yes, I'm excited in terms of where this is going to take us therapeutically, and I just hope that it's sooner rather than later that in the United States it becomes available and affordable. That's the huge part.
Mm.
So kind of just to close up, you know, and at the bottom of the slides it says, like, when we talked about relationships and seeking safety, as counterintuitive as it might seem, we as women may have been through experiences in our own families of origin where the relationship was abusive that we witnessed between our parents or who our caregivers were, but that was normal. Chaos was normal, and we then as adults may seek relationships with individuals who subconsciously we recognize the red flags when we know that's going to be an abusive relationship subconsciously, but to us that chaos is safer than true safety, right? So, this idea that we reinforce the story we believe about ourselves in the world and that our protective parts choose the safety of what is known over the unknown is part of some of the addictions that we experience. We will choose things that are familiar, and that seems safe. And those parts of us that are encouraging us to choose that believe that that's actually going to protect us and be safer than what truly would be, right? So I think that I will leave it on that note. I don't believe yep, I think that was the last slide that I had. Yes. So, I can stop sharing my screen.
Great.
And anybody has any questions or anything else you want to talk about before we wrap it up?
Allie, are you there?
Yes, guys, I'm sorry I couldn't be home with my camera on for this. I've been driving the whole time.
That's
But
okay. I
it's been
just
great
wanted
to
to,
listen in,
yeah, Allie, I think that when you we post this, you'd benefit from seeing the slides if you haven't seen them yet.
for sure.
Do you have any questions or comments for Kathleen, Allie?
No, I thought this was so great. There were so many things that stood out. I really loved how you talked about the freeze and fight or flight. I think not enough people discuss that and they'll associate the freeze with the fight, but I really appreciated that distinction. And the talk of relationships as an addiction, that's something Steph and I have been digging into a lot. And I really valued hearing you talk about that.
Yeah, that
Thank
is something not to disclose too much, but what I've kind of witnessed is that maybe certain addictions start out as more of an obvious chemical, but how they, maybe we can overcome that, but then it's still coming through the psyche and the expression through these other means of addiction. So I think that's something that we, we should be in, it should bring up more, how you might be not addicted to this particular chemical anymore, but the behavior is actually still there, playing out with a different mask on.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And one other aspect of the fight, fight, or freeze is also fawn. So this is another reaction that we may have to trauma, where what we do is it's connected to that part of the people pleaser. We will do anything we need to that our abuser or the person, the instigator of the trauma is wanting, in order to avoid something worse from happening. So we fawn, we become very, very submissive.
Wow.
Kathy, this has been fantastic. I mean, it was so richly packed with information and you presented it so well. I have so many ideas of things that I'd like to share with you about potential future possible presentations,
Yeah.
really based off of these core principles.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can't thank you enough. And with your permission, I can't wait to share this with people and get their feedback.
Wonderful. Yes. Sounds great.
Awesome. Great. Anything else, Allie?
No, thank you so much, Kathy. This was awesome. And thank you, Steph, for putting it together.
Welcome.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And Kathleen, thank you for getting up so early in Alaska and doing this. We really appreciate you.
Oh, it's all good. I enjoy this. I enjoy the fellowship and sharing this information and learning from you all as well. And I get up at this time every day during the week for my job anyway, so it's pretty normal for me. Although I probably will take a nap today, but that's all good.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. I may too. It's even though I've heard a lot of this stuff, it's deep. It penetrates deep if you allow it to go in, and that does take energy.
Yes,
Yeah.
it absolutely does.
So, all right.
Join